Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conspirituality. I'm Derek Barris.
I'm Matthew Remski.
I'm Julian Walker.
And stay up to date with us on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Conspirituality Podcast, as well as our Patreon page, where you can help support our efforts if you are so inclined. That's patreon.com/Conspirituality. And also, I never mention this, but YouTube, because we do record video as well. So if you want to actually see us and see some of the graphics and stuff, we're at youtube.com/Conspirituality.
As Christiane Northrup's social media feed descends even further into the delusional zone, this week she retweeted explicitly identified QAnon content. We asked Professor Jacqueline Antonovich of Nursing Clio about the history of charisma, magic, and entrepreneurship in women's wellness. When we asked if she was surprised by Northrup's conspirituality spiral, Antonovich was clear, not at all. She carefully unpacks why for us. We're also going to look at the role of media in conspiritual thinking and discuss Northrup's enthusiastic endorsement of the movement to make Americans free again by becoming single-issue voters. That single issue? Vaccines.
We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us, wrote Marshall McLuhan in his long celebrated and admittedly difficult 1964 book, Understanding Media. In the book, he writes that two technological revolutions changed how we perceive the world. The printing press, which forced the way that we think to be confined to evenly spaced text, read left to right on the page. And in fact, for a while, there were no spaces between words to mimic how thoughts naturally flow. The other was electricity, which brought with it all the forms of media we consume today, such as television, radio and its evolution, podcasts, and computers. Unfortunately, he died before he could see the ramifications of the internet. McLuhan felt that media presented electrically could potentially eliminate the bounds of space and time, and once again return us to thinking in circles instead of the linear progression of stories told on the page. The medium is the message, indeed, but also what we become, what we behold. This was true when Gutenberg invented the printing press. There was no media as we understand it now. Anyone could hire a printing press to produce leaflets and manuscripts. There were no fact checkers to ensure that wherever was printed passed an ideological purity test. Whoever could afford to produce and distribute their writing had an edge. In a 2012 essay in his own Lapham's Quarterly, the writer Louis Lapham regards the internet as the best and brightest machine ever made by man. He also notes that the internet is still a toy. Language itself, well, who knows how long that actually took to evolve. But from the clay tablets that we started writing on, it took another 3,300 years to reach the codex. Movable type took another 1,150 years. And 532 years later, we achieved the internet, which is now roughly a half century old. But even the widespread usage of the internet, we're still in the early part of the third decade. At each interval, the media has been a representation of what humans are experiencing at that moment. Even McLuhan knew that media were make-happen agents more than make-aware agents. So I'm not sure where we got this notion of a purely objective, unbiased media. That seems more a creation of the imagination to pit one side against the other than any fair and balanced fact. Now, in this week's New Yorker, Michael Liu writes about a 1943 commission of media experts and academics who are trying to assess the role of journalism in American democracy. He writes, "Commission members worried about the forces of division in American society, the power of tribalism to warp political debate, and the press's role in provoking discord. Americans were inhabiting different worlds of fact and judgment. At the time, media consisted of print, radio, and television, though as the channels were few, the funnel into American homes was rather narrow. The commission met 17 times over a number of years to produce a report in which they identified 5 essential mandates for the press that were integral to a functioning democracy. And they were to provide a truthful, comprehensive, and intelligent account of the day's events, to furnish a forum for discussion of all the important viewpoints and interests in the society, to offer a representative picture of society and its various groups, to educate the public on the ideals toward which the community should strive, and to make information available to everybody. The commission also found that the press failed on every single account, mostly because journalists were forced to focus on novel and sensational stories due to market pressures. This report was published in 1947. So media has never been perfect, and yet it has always been essential. There are still many organizations that focus too much on the novel and sensational, but what I fear more than their clickbait is their absence. In this conspirituality circuit we discuss on this podcast, I see influencers sharing stories by the Epoch Times, which is the media arm of the Falun Gong religious movement. While the group protesting in New York's Union Square and elsewhere presents itself as a meditative spiritual outfit, take that as seriously as Scientologists reading your stress levels with a soup can. Falun Gong's founder, Li Hongzhi, claims that aliens infected human minds in the 20th century and invented computers, and that both feminism and homosexuality are sins. He also claims he can walk through walls and levitate. Now, this same group pumped $10 million into pro-Trump ads on Facebook, and it has produced the most pro-Trump advertising online anywhere, even more than the Trump campaign.
Wow.
Then there's One America News Network, Trump's current favorite media outlet. Many of the talking points we discuss on this show, such as 5G and anti-vax campaigns, make their way into social media via OAN. The company was founded by Robert Herring Sr., who has explicitly ordered pro-Trump and anti-abortion stories on his network. He's also directed his reporters to minimize information about Russian interference in the US elections, which makes sense given that one of the network's major personalities, Christiane Ruiz, last worked for Sputnik, which is the Kremlin's official propaganda outlet. Recent research for Columbia University identified 429 websites that currently advertise themselves to be local news outlets. Of those 429, 8 are liberal. We've endured 5 years of attacks on the mainstream media by the loudest voice on Twitter, and that started well before he was in office. Trump's influence is abundantly apparent right now, especially in all of those YouTube journalists that are exposing the secrets about COVID-19. I repeat this over and over when I'm talking to people on social media. There is no such thing as the mainstream media. That is an invention. It's not real. The acronym MSM is simply another buzzword that's shorthand for anything I don't believe in. While journalists should never get a free pass for their transgressions, they are the only layer between authoritarian propaganda and the public. Now, as with the founding of the printing press, everyone has a media channel right now. And as we cover week by week, plenty of influential people have no regard for where their information is sourced. They take no responsibility for their words, and if they're shown to be wrong, they only double down by blocking dissenting voices. At least the old guard, like the New York Times, prints retractions and apologizes. We've entered what Michael Liu writes in the understatement of the year, a disorienting, destabilizing moment for members of the press. But I'll say this, if you think that the work that ProPublica is doing is akin to what David Icke is doing, then you have problems in your understanding of what media is. I'll add London Real and whatever else to that. Now, at least we can be comforted by the fact that none of this is new. The 15th century Illuminati believed that signs of the devil were encoded in books printed on Gutenberg's press. Now, today, wearing red shoes on Twitter is your passport into the twisted world of QAnon. We've made it through one secret society, and we're surely likely to make it through another. But I do worry about what we're going to lose along the way.
Yeah, well done, Derek.
Wow.
I'm so glad you started with McLuhan. Speaking as somebody from his hometown, he's an icon here in Toronto. There's at where I went to school at U of T, I think there's statues of him all over. And one of the things that I think he would have been incredibly interested in is the kind of the that his prediction around, or his excavation of this concern that preceded the development of text, that somehow if we started writing things down, we would be offloading our memories. He described really poignantly how coming out of oral histories and oral cultures, that there was a fear of writing, especially amongst those who protected that knowledge, that somehow we would start forgetting how to learn, we would forget how to remember. And one of the things that is just incredible to me day by day is how the print that we see in social media and the internet more generally, it never disappears. Nothing ever disappears. And in some way, we have access to incredible cultural memory. But on the other hand, there's very, very little accountability, as you said, Derek, for what's said. It's almost as if print in online forums is equally erasable, not because it can't be retrieved, but because there's always more print being added. And that's really strange. And I posted to Facebook this week that it's one of the weirdest things about covering conspiritualists is that, of course, there are no retractions. You know, if something's proven to be wrong, if something's proven to be wrong, it just sort of, the next thing piles on top. And so, yeah, I'm sure Marshall would have a lot to say about that.
Well, it's also, I began my training as a news journalist when I graduated college, and I didn't stick with that because honestly, I just enjoyed entertainment writing more, and I went into music journalism for a decade. But having some training and having worked in news for a few years through college and out, just the lack of understanding about what people are doing and the way it's being presented is just super frustrating, especially when it is the only layer between complete authoritarian rule and us right now. And I attribute it to living in a culture of privilege and not understanding the stakes, because that's everything that I see. It's just that. I mean, Julian, you could probably speak to that, being in an growing up in an apartheid state and not understanding that what we're actually losing right now is a lot more than our freedom to not wear a mask or any of these other insane things we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll never forget my first few years living in this country. There was a local election, and I didn't really understand about local elections, having grown up in a country where there were no free elections. There white people got to vote. We had national elections, but there wasn't as much involvement in the political process. And I asked the guy who I hung out with at the coffee shop, what are some of the issues? And he said, well, there's one issue I really want to make sure I vote on, which is that they're trying to force us to wear helmets when we ride motorcycles. And that is an infringement of my freedom. I remember sitting there, I was probably like 21, 22, just my mind was just blown. And this is just an extension of that.
I think everyone would benefit. One of the hardest parts about being a local news reporter is all of the zoning board and school board meetings I had to attend to try to drum up stories.
Oh, for
and
sure.
watching people from the town talk to the elected representatives about how mad they were that when the garbage men collected their garbage, sometimes the garbage cans would be put back sideways or on the ground and not stood up perfectly. And just to understand what actually happens and how important local news is beyond that. But if everyone it's just our lack of civic understanding and the lack of civics that we have growing up is really, we're watching the results of that right now.
Right.
Along with that very, very privileged sort of cluelessness about so much of what really goes on in the world and everything, the mainstream media, like how is news produced? What is truth? What are the stakes actually? So along those lines, let's go to this week in Conspirituality. For me, Back to Christiane Northrup. In her Great Awakening videos over this past week, Northrup has reliably always repeated one new and enthusiastic refrain. In fact, it was even part of the title of 2 out of the 4 of her videos I looked at from the last week or so. She is exhorting her 500,000 Facebook followers to join Dr. Pam Popper's Make Americans Free Again campaign, where she says we can have power as one-issue voters. So first, let's talk about Pam Popper a little bit. She has 87,000 followers on YouTube and makes news report style videos every few days. She uses examples of COVID testing and reporting mistakes or confusions as evidence to assert a conspiracy around inflating numbers for the purpose of controlling and terrorizing the population, of course, so as to impose arbitrary rules upon us. She really enjoys referring to Emperor Newsom and Cuomo as if they are dictatorial figures robbing us of our civil liberties. At one point, Popper compares California's state recommendations for masks during wildfires to COVID-19 recommendations, citing what she sees as obvious contradictions regarding people with heart or breathing conditions being told not to wear masks during wildfires because that would be dangerous for them. Obviously, wildfires and the threat of a global pandemic are exactly the same thing. She says if you don't want to get lung disease, you don't want to wear a mask and breathe in all that carbon dioxide. So Pam Popper's audience is mostly in the US, but she says we're happy to share resources with anyone in foreign countries who wants to join in. Remember, the idea is to form the biggest group of people surrounding a single issue. So we can just overwhelm the system with lawsuits and protests and civil disobedience and voting blocks to get rid of politicians we want to get rid of and vote in the ones who support what we support. Says Popper, we're working very hard to change this despotic mess, this dystopian nightmare we're living under. How are we going to do that? Via the website that Northrup is also directing people towards. So I thought I would check this out. The very new MakeAmericansFreeAgain.com website really only has 3 visible functions. The first is to deliver the message that by focusing only on one candidate's position, the question of vaccines, we can make our voting choices. The second is to encourage people to begin the process of learning how to homeschool their kids so as to avoid vaccines and limit the traumatizing and unnecessary social distancing and mask wearing measures that are going on right now under COVID-19. Of course, you can join the email list to find out more about both or either of these topics. The third function of the website is to drive traffic to Pam Popper's personal Wellness Forum Health website, which is where things get kind of interesting. Wellness Forum Health generates income in a variety of ways. There's a lot. Now here we have the overlap that we've been looking at the whole time, right? She has a lot of gluten-free health food products, smoothie mixes, pre-packaged ingredients so that you can bake your own bread, you can make your own desserts, soup powders, as well as natural bathroom supplies, so soaps and shampoos and toothpaste and the like. The Cadillac, in terms of the products she sells, is water filtration systems, ranging from between $80 to $800 for showers, faucets, or for the whole house. So you start to get the picture here that wellness is really about specific dietary requirements and ways in which to filter your food. Under a tab on the website called Athletics, wouldn't you know it, hot yoga, with a quote from Hippocrates, "Give me a fever and I can cure anything." So you can
love his online classes. I turn up the heat in here and wow, yeah.
Is Popper a naturopath or a therapist or an osteopath
it's
or something?
It's not entirely clear.
Okay.
She does offer some cognitive behavioral therapy. I haven't dug into that yet to see what her credentials are with regard to that. Nowhere is it prominently displayed. A lot of it seems to be around diet. So right. I'm wondering if she's a dietitian. Again, it's not really clearly mapped out.
And are the products all her own? Are they branded, are they under her brand?
It's a PDF.
Right.
And really laid out like a menu where
Okay.
you're ordering the ingredients for specific dishes. So it
Okay.
seems that it's her recipes. I don't know if it's under her label or not. None of that is
Right.
clear.
Right.
Yeah. But it's really the Wellness Forum Institute health programs that appear to bring in the big bucks. She has multiple levels of monthly payment for services like health planning and coaching, weight loss, teleconference calls, and live streaming events that you get access to depending on where you join. And at the top of the pyramid, she has health professional training diplomas. The costs for any of this stuff range between $100 and $1,000 a year. Now, as an interesting aside, one of Dr. Popper's videos mentioned the Giant Eagle lawsuits. You guys heard about this?
No.
So she directed her viewers to check out Peggy Hall. It turns out there were 34 lawsuits against a grocery chain in Pennsylvania called Giant Eagle, all for unlawfully requiring the wearing of a mask while shopping.
Oh.
Now, many of these cases look like they're from people with legitimate health reasons for not wearing a mask. And the claims are that they were mistreated by Giant Eagle staff. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this is a set of lawsuits around discrimination against disability. But when we look up Peggy Hall, we find that with 40,000 YouTube subscribers, she has almost 100,000 views on a video called No Mask, No Problem. Here, Ms. Hall instructs viewers on how to use a legal loophole argument to resist the tyranny of masks and force stores to let you in without one. The key way to do so, tell them you have a medical exemption. They can't ask you what it is, or you can sue them. Presumably, people with heart or lung illness, in Peggy Hall's universe, would want to be in public spaces at greater risk with no masks at all as the pandemic hits critical mass this week. Really crazy. In another video, How to Shop Without a Mask, which has 30,000 views, Hall says this: "It's not about the mask. I don't do this work because I care about shopping at Costco without a mask. I do this work because I care about living in a free society in which I can make my own health choices. I do this work because of the elderly who are being abused under a kind of imprisonment in nursing homes and are not able to see their loved ones. This is where my heart breaks." So we see how from the faulty and conspiracy-based assumptions that Hall and Popper and Northrup all share, that COVID-19 is largely a fabricated psyop designed to provoke fear and justify draconian control. All of these counterproductive and dangerous distortions of reality in the name of a kind of co-opted resistance and struggle for freedom leads to a funnel, driving our one-issue voters into the arms of the now growing legion of Trump QAnon candidates itching to get into power.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. So I mean, one issue voting is nothing new.
Yeah.
People will use
Sure.
abortion as a litmus test, or they
Guns.
use the Second Amendment as a litmus test, or you know, freedom of religious expression, or even things like charter schools versus the capacity to the right to homeschool or to be funded to homeschool. So is Popper and therefore Northrup, are they saying that just for now or for November that their single issue is vaccines, and that's going to be their threshold or their litmus test?
They're not being clear about any of that. Essentially, they're just saying we want to create this powerful bloc who are organized around this one issue. And the way they frame the question specifically is, you should ask any politician, do you support my right to have control over what gets injected into my body or my children's body? Just that.
Right.
And they're not saying anything else beyond that, but it does seem to be very much organized around the coming election.
Right. And then about homeschooling, did you see anything in Popper's materials that that identified any kind of political or religious agenda around the values of homeschooling?
No.
Okay.
No, it was again, it's a very new website.
Right.
And So under the homeschooling part was the most limited in terms of what's
Right.
already up there, and mostly it was reasons to homeschool. Kids learn better. There's less competition, and then you'll get away with not having the mandatory vaccine and not having to deal with masks.
Right. I mean, there's so much up in the air about that. I mean, none of those things are. There's no consensus around any of those issues, obviously. But I'm interested in homeschooling would limit the social isolation of the children that are homeschooled. Is a very strange argument. It would apply to very few people. I mean, we're looking. We don't know yet in Toronto or in Ontario here what our school for September is going to look like for our sons who are 4 and 7. But there's no really good answer. If we homeschool them, they're isolated from their own friends. If we send them to school with distancing measures, there's strangeness and alienation and a kind of hypervigilance involved with that.
It sucks.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible all the way around. So, but that's interesting. I haven't heard that angle yet. That to be pro homeschooling. Well, also that would slide into, we don't generally want our children to be indoctrinated by the state, right?
Exactly.
Right. So it's not just mandatory vaccines. There's got to be other things that Popper would appreciate her children not learning or other people's children not learning.
Yeah, probably some perception that there's a liberal agenda that they're going to have imposed upon them.
Yeah, maybe. Wow.
Given her love for the elderly, can you talk a little bit about the page on her website where she discusses about the problems that happened in the first place systemically that allowed the coronavirus to ravage nursing homes around the country? I'm sure she really cares about that.
Yeah, none of that, of course. I mean, I dug into quite a bunch of different stuff this week. It's hard to even choose. But this notion that what really breaks her heart, and this was actually Peggy Hall, is that not only the elderly, but she also even mentions people who are in group homes, people who, for various reasons, are unable to see their loved ones, really for their own protection, are in some kind of tyrannical imprisonment. It's bizarre.
Right. Okay, well, I don't really have a news item for this week. It's more thematic. And what I'd like to do is speak about the notion of betrayal in the discourse and in the figures that we're looking at. One of the amazing stories that you'll hear Professor Antonovich recount in our interview is the story of how Louise Hay interacted with the very diverse gay community during the height of the AIDS epidemic. She explained, I didn't know this, that Hay had this split message. She did, and she said two very different things. And I was familiar with one part of this, and in fact, in an interview that I think we'll post next week that I did with my colleague Jivana Heyman, the founder of Accessible Yoga, the subject will be ableism in conspirituality. He was describing that he had come to San Francisco to come out as a young man and to have fun, and that, of course, he arrived during the height of the epidemic. And he told me that many of his fellow activists at the time were disgusted by the fact that Louise Hay brought this victim-blaming discourse to the disease. Her whole thing is based upon the premise that belief becomes thought, and thought becomes feeling, and feeling becomes biology. And that theme is basically, it tracks back, as you showed, Julian, in a couple episodes back, to Mary Baker Eddy, and it tracks forward as well through Northrup to people like Kelly Brogan. So Hay would characterize AIDS as a disease of self-hatred, and then she would suggest that if gay men would only stop hating themselves, they wouldn't be getting sick. And it's just a disgusting argument. It's delusional, but it also makes homophobia socially acceptable in a way, and even spiritualized amongst a certain demographic. I think it lets people who think of themselves as nice people hate gay people in some ultimately passive-aggressive way. And one thing that Jivana said was that Hay's argument wasn't all that different from more progressive Christian arguments, which didn't focus necessarily on sin and hellfire, but did suggest that if gay men stopped being gay, they wouldn't be punished by God. Okay, so about the betrayal part, Professor Antonovich explains that Hay's thinly veiled hatred was complicated by the fact that she also preached a very compelling and powerful gospel of radical self-acceptance. So here was this woman who in the 1980s was in her 50s or 60s or something like that, and she might have been the only woman of that age with a mass media platform with a kind of maternal bearing who would be able to say to a whole generation of gay men, you really deserve to love yourself. You really deserve to accept yourself completely. And so these two messages together make an incredibly complicated combination, because if the young gay man is listening to her, he's supposed to accept himself, but then contained within that acceptance is the thorn of realizing that he is to blame either for his own illness or for his vulnerability, or for the fact that people are dying around him. So it's both a gift and a threat at the same time. Radically love yourself, which can feel like a liberating message, but then also recognize that if you're ill or depressed or anxious, or if people are dropping dead around you, it's because you haven't accepted yourself. So everything is up to you. And the gaslighty part of this contradiction really ties people up in emotional knots. And it has nothing to do with the ravages of a virus that strikes unequally amongst the human population. So I think that sounds familiar. So that's one example of betrayal. To go back to Northrup, I'd like to use some of her material as a second example, especially the incredible about face that she takes historically. Here's somebody who emerges as a warrior against what she calls medical patriarchy. And she has real skin in the game. She realizes after participating in countless harsh intervention-heavy childbirths, after seeing hundreds of male babies strapped to the circumstraint so that she could circumcise them, she sees the light. She comes to Jesus or Goddess. And she understands that there is a barbarity to certain unquestioned medical practices, that they are unfair, that they objectify the body, and that also that there's this need for things to be clean and orderly in clinical settings that for the most part is targeted at the bodies of women. So for her to go on in the middle of a pandemic when women especially are working harder than ever before because our divisions of domestic labor are still unequal, and then to go on and boost one charismatic male figure after another for their pseudoscience, like when we see her fawning all over Andrew Wakefield or talking about what a dreamboat Zach Bush is, when she shares posts from Tony Robbins, who's a sex offender, or the anti-vax guy, Del Bigtree. And meanwhile, there's not a single practicing women's medicine figure whose work she is boosting. Like, who does she boost instead amongst women? She boosts channelers and spirit mediums who believe they're talking to the Galactic Federation about pedophile lizards. So this brings up the betrayal. This is my theme of abdicating a lifelong responsibility and mission to improve the discourse around women's health, especially women's reproductive health. And it seems to me like a selfish abdication, because only Dr. Northrup is allowed to be a woman doctor on her page, it seems. So the last example I have is really a meta example. It's a structural critique of the overall rhythm of conspirituality, which I've kind of like hinted at this a number of times in previous episodes, but I'm just going to underline it here. The rhythm of the entire conspirituality movement is rooted in betrayal, because what all of these figures do is they offer love and then they offer terror, and then they cycle back and forth between these two things in ways that I've used the work of Alexandra Stein, for example, and her notions of disorganized attachment in cults to examine. But the basic substructure is betrayal, like love in one hand, terror in the other. And, it really makes me wonder what is going on in the hearts of people who are caught up in it. Like, how much do people have to be hurting to be locked into this rhythm of like emotional junk food, to be, almost thrilled by this empty offer of mystical hope, but then also terrified by the fantasy that authoritarian control is lurking in face masks. In every single one of Northrup's Great Awakening sermons, she's referring both to the abject horror of a kind of fantasized authoritarian rule of public health, and then also to the sublime inevitability of speaking with the angels. And the only reason that this is not recognized as betrayal is that all of these people, Northrup, Bush, Brogan, G, they keep smiling. They're really good at maintaining the performance of care. So I was really privileged to interview Jacqueline Antonovich. She's an assistant professor of history at Muhlenberg College. Her current research focuses on women physicians, race, gender, and medical imperialism in the American West. And she's also the creator and co-founder of an amazing site called Nursing Clio. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2018. So this is our interview. Professor Antonovich, thank you so much for taking the time.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start with a positionality observation and a question. So over a few episodes, we are three men who are studying strains of conspirituality in the social media feeds of a beloved woman emeritus doctor. Many of her followers will identify as feminist. And given her enormous popularity, I don't feel like we're punching down, but at the same time, looking closely at a women's health icon is politically fraught, I think, for anybody, but maybe especially for us. Now, you're speaking from a different position. You do this professionally. And I'm wondering, what are some best practices to bear in mind when critiquing the actions of a figure like this with care and respect?
Well, first of all, I think that's a really great question and a great perspective to come from. And, I'm a historian, so I'm going to come at this from the perspective of a historian who studies women and women's health. And one of the things that I often tell my students when we're talking about historical figures is that it's incredibly important to take our historical actors seriously. Right. And I think that works for contemporary actors as well. It doesn't mean that you agree with them. It doesn't mean that you are, taking their position. But it does mean that you try to seriously understand the logic from which people are coming from. Right. Because there is a logic to where people are coming from. We tend to dismiss people that have ideas that we don't agree with as just, being Looney Tunes, or something like that. But I think that you can't get past, if that's the position that you're coming from, then you can't get past that, right? So trying to understand the logic from which people are coming from is really important. And in terms of women's health, and again, speaking as a historian, this taking our historical actors seriously is vital because there is, so this sort of mistrust of the medical education, mistrust of authority has deep roots in our history of women's health, right? So if I can just back up for a little bit, and if we think about prior to the mid-19th century, when women gave birth, they gave birth surrounded by women community members and a midwife, right? What we call a social birth. And then beginning in the mid-19th century, that's when male physicians started, in a United States context anyway, stepped into the picture. Now it's important to complicate this. This was something that many women were asking for, right? They perceived that it would be safer if a physician was in attendance. But that being said, that moment that male physicians sort of entered the realm of women's health, that's a point in which women started to lose their voice in their decision-making process, right? And so then you think about things like, if you've ever read the Charlotte Perkins Gilman story, The Yellow Wallpaper.
I haven't,
right?
no.
Okay, so that's basically a story about a woman who, her husband, who is also a physician, and her husband's brother was a physician, believe that the main character is suffering from hysteria,
Right.
possibly postpartum depression, but that doesn't, we don't have that diagnosis at the time. And so the cure for that is to put her up in a room where she cannot, she's not allowed to leave her room. She's, completely devoid of any agency. And then she ends up, spoiler alert, she ends up sort of going crazy and seeing, images in the yellow wallpaper, right?
Wow. Is she separated from her baby as well?
The baby doesn't really figure into the story. It's been a while since I've read it, but
Right.
yes. So she's all alone,
right?
And she's in this room. She can't go outside, and all of her decisions are made for her, and it so sort of slowly drives, her mad. But hysteria was a real diagnosis, that was often attached to women by male physicians for a variety of issues stemming from postpartum depression, regular depression, maybe being a little bit too, mouthy, or being too,
Right.
strong and independent. You could also be suffering from hysteria. So you get this moment in time where medical diagnoses are beginning to sort of cover a lot of different behavioral, issues from women. But this even continues. If it wasn't that long ago, in the 1950s, 60s, and even going up into the 1970s, that if you were a woman and you were suffering from, let's say, breast cancer, that the physician would be having conversations with your husband,
Right.
and not yourself, right? And even when we factor in race, it gets more fraught, right? So going back to the time of the slave system, enslaved women getting experimented on by physicians, and the famous case of Henrietta Lacks, later on in history, where her HeLa cells are extracted, or her cells are extracted and become HeLa cells without her consent. And even up into today, we have lots of studies about physicians not believing Black women and their pain.
Right.
Right. So long story short, I think that throughout history, women like Dr. Northrup have been responding to issues of trust that women have had in the medical community. And so I think it's important to come at it from that perspective in order to sort of understand what's going on.
Right, and to take it seriously, as you say, because there's a wealth of history behind what she's been able to accomplish, and she's built up this solid, decades worth of OBGYN credentials and all of this clinical service, and I imagine like a very, very winning bedside manner with her clients, and she's done this all within the context of rebelling against some of what you've described, and that she calls the dominator patriarchy in medicine, and she does so while advocating for what she calls feminine intelligence, and all of this is really hard won, and one thing that I found really poignant in her account was the moment where she realizes, she writes about this in a couple of different places, the moment that she realizes that after circumcising hundreds of little boys as an obstetrician, she realizes this practice is barbaric as well. It's not just the, too many interventions in childbirth, but also what happens to children.
Yes.
And that's just one example. But I wanted to ask very generally about what kind of environment would she have been entering into in the field of women's medicine as she graduates from Dartmouth Medical in 1975?
Yes, so that's really interesting, and I wanted to get just really quickly back to your point about her sort of making this argument that she's intervening in sort of this patriarchal medical system.
Right.
She's not entirely wrong, right? Especially if she's a graduate, in the 1970s,
right,
where it was incredibly hard to be a woman physician, even in med school. And I think that's where a lot of these conspiracy theorists sort of are able to get a foothold in, right? Because they're kernels of truth in what they're talking about, right? And she's really good at that.
Right.
And then sort of spinning it out. But to get back to your question, whenever you ask me these questions, I'm always going to say, let's back up a little bit, right?
Right.
Just to give you a little bit of context, the very first woman physician in the United States with a medical degree was all the way back in 1849. And it was a woman named Elizabeth Blackwell, who she graduated from Genova Medical College in New York. And basically she was sort of admitted as a joke, but she, got in anyway. And from that point on, following her footsteps, there was a whole generation or two of women physicians in the United States. And that's partly because mid-19th century, all the way through, pushing up to the 1915, the medical world was really unstable, right? This is when you get the development of different, what we call medical sects, right? We get things like homeopathy, we get things like chiropractic, we get osteopathy, we get all sorts of different alternative medicines emerging during this time as a pushback against regular medicine, which was largely like bloodletting and mercury treatments. Mm-hmm. And so within that alternative medicine fields, these various fields, women physicians were really able to step in and become physicians.
And did they gravitate towards those alternative modalities that were competing for space with the conventional modalities?
They did, because at the time, the mid-19th century, if you were called what we called a regular physician, right? Your regimen of treatment consisted of things like, as I mentioned before, bloodletting, giving people emmenagogues to make them vomit, purgatives, and also things to make a very, bowel movements. And we relied on a lot of mercury treatments and very harsh chemicals. And so you have something like homeopathy that comes along and promises not only, we're going to give you medicines that are not going to make you vomit or make you sick, right? But that we're going to focus on treating the whole patient.
Wow.
And this was very attractive to women who wanted to enter the medical field. And that's not to say that women didn't become regular physicians.
Right.
But that's also because a lot of these new medical field or, medical sects opening up, were more open to letting women in too, right? So it sort of went both ways. But I do also want to point out that, so women physicians, sort of the zenith of women physicians in the 20th century was the 1920s. And for various reasons, because we started reforming our medical education system, starting in the 1920s, those numbers went all the way down, and they didn't recover until the 1970s. And so that's sort of the that's where we place Dr. Northrup, right? And this sort of just when women are starting to return to medical school in larger numbers. We've always had women physicians in the 20th century, but in the 1970s is when the numbers start bouncing back.
So there was something about the interwar period that opened up the doors for women physicians. Was that did that have something to do with World War I nursing or something like that? Or
yes, so World War I, definitely there were more opportunities for women physicians, but they had been being trained for decades before that.
Right.
And they were in a lot of public health work. They were in a lot of private practice. But World War I really did open up opportunities for women physicians to serve, not necessarily in the military, but things in like the Red Cross Auxiliary, things like that.
Right.
But following the war, opportunities for women physicians really declined. That has a lot to do with how we reformed medical education. Before, you could go get a medical degree at night, you could go part-time, you could stop and start, you could work your way through.
Wow, okay.
But, beginning in the 1910s-ish, when we started reforming things and we started adding residencies on there, attaching medical education to the universities, it became a lot harder for a woman to become a physician. right? And raise a family and do all of these things. And so that's, these numbers recover in the 1970s, and that's the world that Dr. Northrup is stepping into. And I will say one thing that Dr. Northrup has in common with her earlier, sort of women physician ancestors is that they were both butting up against sort of midwifery, right?
Oh, right.
So late 19th century, early 20th century women physicians were really trying to distance themselves from midwives, these women who normally delivered babies. Women physicians would say things like, we are better than midwives because we're medically trained, right? And that we can provide better care than these midwives. So they really did that in a way to sort of try and push for their own professionalization. And I just find it interesting that Northrup at the same time is pushing, is in that world where natural health comes back, right? And women are starting to return to, midwifery.
Right. I have to, it makes me realize that I have to look back through her book and see what she has to say about midwifery, if anything, because that's a really standout point, because I imagine in the 1970s, as you say, that same tension is going to be prevalent.
Yeah. And I think that maybe that's one way that she is able to position herself in medicine as being woman friendly, right? In that, she, by recognizing and naming what she sees as patriarchal medicine, she can still exist within that system as sort of a rebel within the system.
Right.
Is that, you know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah.
And just as a side note, now women outnumber men in medical schools. And that just happened in the last couple of years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe, we'll come back to that, because part of what I feel reading through some of her literature is a critique that comes out of an older era. I mean, in my own life, all of my primary care physician is a woman. I've had 3 specialists for various issues that are all women. My family members are being cared for by women. I don't think there's a male doctor actually in my extended family. And so the statements that are made consistently about men who are in control just seem to be targeted at some other era. So I find that very interesting, but nonetheless, they seem to be still very powerful and resonant arguments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the other thing that's happening in the 70s is the human potential movement. And, so in that vein, I wanted to note that Northrup lists a lot of inspirations. One of them that stands out is Louise Hay. And Northrup thanks Hay profusely in her best-selling book. And she quotes Hay repeatedly on the axiom that thoughts become beliefs and beliefs become biology. And it seems that Hay's You Can Heal Your Life lays down a kind of, which is 1984, lays down a kind of ideological groundwork that Northrup is able to fill in with medical details 15 years later in Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom. Now, what do you have thoughts about Hay and a health and wellness landscape in which her influence and her media platform play a central role?
I mean, I do. I think Hay is a fascinating figure, right?
Yes.
And I do want to say, just sort of give a shout out. Everything I know about Elizabeth Hay, I know from a historian named Sarah Swedberg, who wrote this incredible piece about her life and Nursing Cleo, which is a blog that I edit.
Is it on the blog? It's on the blog.
It is on the blog.
We can link to it. We can link to it in the show notes.
Great, absolutely. But Hay was a metaphysical healer, as you said, right? And she began practicing at the First Church of Religious Science in the 1960s. In the 1976, she publishes this pamphlet called Heal Your Body. And what I find particularly interesting about her, and again, this is in Dr. Swedberg's essay, is her work in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Right? As you said, Hay blames disease on behavior and negativity. She doesn't blame AIDS on the virus, right? She doesn't blame illness on bacteria or genetic disposition. And so you can see how her work on AIDS might be a little bit problematic, right?
It definitely is. In fact, I've read a number of articles from ACT UP activists from the era about how detrimental her publications were to the movement.
Yes, but you know, she's got this whole you know, her whole philosophy is a very classic blame the victim you know, perspective that you know, you often run into in the history of medicine. This is nothing new, right? But it's also important to point out that she had a huge following in gay communities, and that's because she preached radical self-acceptance and self-love.
Wow, what a
right?
double-edged sword. So I didn't hear that part of it.
And that's new, right?
Right.
For gay men, mostly gay
Right.
men in the 1980s, learning how to accept yourself and to love yourself was a radical thing to do,
So
right? And so
she was able to do two things at the same time: radical self-acceptance, accept that the part of you that is able to engage in this risky behavior or whatever is actually what's responsible for, or it's not. Is it about self-perception is the actual virus?
Well, she calls diseases dis-ease, right? DIS/EASE. And she's saying that disease can be healed if you're willing to change the way you think, change the way you act, change the way you believe. And part of that healing process is loving yourself.
Right.
So you can see, you know, so and part of that sort of preaching that she did in the 1980s, she did these things called hay rides, right? Where she would gather, you know, people suffering from AIDS and, you know, HIV and AIDS. And, you know, for many of them left with a lot of anger. They didn't, they were very sort of taken aback by her, you know, blame the victim mentality. But a lot of men, you know, found that just human contact and that, preaching of self-love really useful for them at a point in which many of their families had abandoned them.
Right.
Hay was providing, and again, this gets back to Northrup, Hay was providing something for some of these men that they weren't getting.
It's amazing because it's almost like the medicine there becomes poisonous at the point at which it doesn't offer medicine, right? So there's radical self-acceptance, which must be incredibly edifying and poignant for so many people. But if that's where it ends, then that's supposedly the curative for the actual virus. It's what an interesting story.
It's complicated, right? Wow. And as often as I tell my students, because, you know, now they're, we're not alive when, at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And I think that, it's hard to, it's easy to forget if you weren't within that community, just how isolated and, marginalized and discriminated against, people who were dying of AIDS were. So, yeah.
Now, what about the money stuff, though? Because I found this 2007 conversation between Northrup and Hay, and Northrup recalls, I think they were at a convention in Las Vegas, and Hay is one of the Northrup is one of the lead guests, and Chopra is one of the lead guests, and Northrup and Hay are on stage, and she's remembering that Hay hosted her on her book tour in 1999, and they rode around in Hayes's Rolls Royce. And Northrup says, quote, "I was just astounded by it, to go out and the unabashed appreciation of having a Rolls Royce. I'm from Maine, the East Coast, where everybody, especially the old money people, they drive beaters and they like to pretend that they don't have any money. And it wasn't that you were ostentatious, it's that you were enjoying every moment." And Hayes then replies that it took her 6 years to manifest that car, and that she loved it, and that she just wanted to show it off and share it. And so there's this prosperity gospel thing that comes in as well. And I'm wondering about the intersection between women's wellness movements and the notion of manifesting abundance in one's life.
I just think that this question is incredibly interesting, right? Because I, from my perspective, this sort of, for lack of a better term, leaning in into sort of this, not being ashamed of your wealth and actually actively pursuing it, seems to be a new thing in terms of women's wellness efforts and women's health movement, right? I mean, typically, historically, women's work, whether that's in the medical field, or even education, these are all seen as from a woman's perspective, it's care work. And you do this care work not because you're looking to make money, but because you care about your communities, right? You care about, so think about, these traditional fields of healing, teaching, even housework, we sort of call of this reproductive labor, right? And it's usually, historically, uncompensated or undercompensated.
Wow, okay.
Right? And it's framed in a very altruistic manner, right? That you're doing this for the good of humanity. You're doing it for the good of womanhood. You're doing it for the good of children, right? And you're not in it for the money. So for me, this whole conversation about, hey, and her fancy car, sort of reminds me of even, her name was going to come up sooner or later, but like Gwyneth Paltrow, right?
Right.
And this sort of corporate feminism, lean in feminism, and not being afraid to make money off the things that you're doing. I don't necessarily have a value judgment about it. I just think it's really interesting that it seems to be a new phenomenon.
Well, speaking of value judgments, something's just clicking or turning around in my brain a little bit around this piece of caregiving work is unpaid labor, and it's always been that way, and it's supposed to be given altruistically. And I just didn't. Now I think I'm going to listen to Hay and Northrup, if she brings it up, speak about wealth or abundance in a way that has behind it this feeling of, well, we've been doing all of this wonderful work for generations, haven't we? Right?
Yeah.
And we've been taking care of people. And of course, this is the most important work in the world. And why shouldn't it be the source of wealth? I haven't considered that. I've that part of the law of attraction and secret stuff. I haven't heard that in there. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. Now, one of the most interesting things as I go through Northrup's writing, her popular medical work, is that it whiplashes, sometimes paragraph by paragraph, between a kind of evidence-based discourse in which she's citing research and studies, and then a language of self-help or new thought or new age stuff in which the intuitive and subjective instincts are centered. So there, she'll have like a bunch of pages on the dangers of the HPV vaccine and why nobody should take it. And then that will be followed up, maybe not followed up, but she'll also have pages on cleansing the second chakra. Now the transitions are never marked. It's like there's no, from this pre-modern point of view, we might say that blah, blah, blah. So there's no sort of flagging of, well, this is where I'm going, or this is the epistemology that I've got right now. Is this blurring of paradigms, does it have a history behind it in women's health and wellness? And if so, like, who would Northrup's precursors be?
Well, that's a great question. I think that I'm going to return to sort of our conversation that we had earlier about the sort of explosion of different kinds of medical systems in the mid 19th century, right?
Right.
If you think about it, it's actually quite incredible that from the time of, so this idea of humoral medicine and bloodletting and all of that, was the dominating medical system since the time of, Hippocrates all the way up into the mid 19th century. There was really, in the United States, when we get to the United States, that's the main sort of system of mainstream medicine. And yet, even before we get this explosion of different medical systems, people are pairing, regular medicine with folk remedies, right, and backyard medicines. That sort of blending, that sort of blending of a paradigm has always existed, right? And especially this gets very heightened when we get to this explosion of different medical systems. You know, people and even physicians would sort of blend regular medicine with homeopathy, or blend, I mean, there's an argument that there's a lot of infighting between all of these different medical systems, but for the most part, a lot of patients would, you know, sort of pick and choose from these different medical theories. And so, you know, whether they're choosing folk remedies or Chinese medicine, you know, we've been doing this for a long time. And this is especially true with women's health. And again, it gets back to that conversation we had about, you know, not really having a lot of trust in mainstream medicine. If something is not working for you or someone's not listening to you, you may listen to what your mother said or what your neighbors are saying about different kinds of sort of folk remedies. And we do this today, right? I know people who have a regular physician, they have a regular OBGYN, but they may go to Whole Foods and buy a homeopathic remedy for their menstrual cramps.
For sure.
Even women and parents who maybe aren't anti-vaccination, right? But they do space out their vaccine schedule for their children. Right?
Right.
Even though they get those vaccines. I see that as a blending of this paradigm as well.
Especially, I suppose, if they supplement with immune support for their children in the interim while they're spacing out or something like that. There's a kind of a mix and match of techniques. You know, I'm realizing that the bias of my question is really very contemporary in the sense that, like, my assumption, I guess, is that people generally have an understanding of what scientific research is, or what, you know, or what I don't know, what clinical trials will show, or how people do meta-analyses and stuff like that. And that they should be able to, or that they're having an internal conversation about, well, this is how this is known versus this is how this is known. But I can imagine that before the internet, and certainly, you know, before university education becomes relatively accessible to a certain amount of the percentage of the population, that's just not true. There's no way for the regular person to really be able to assess different types of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, and this is sort of getting off track, but also I find really interesting. I mean, exactly what you said. There's a historian named Nancy Tomes who wrote this great book called The Gospel of Germs. And her whole argument is, you know, scientists and, you know, largely start discovering bacteria that cause specific diseases, right? Sort of our germ theory starts coming around in the 1870s, 1880s, you know, by the turn of the century, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, you know, scientists and, you know, believe that germ theory is real. But how do you convince regular people, regular housewives, regular children, regular Joes going off to the factory, that these little tiny microscopic things cause diseases? That's a hard sell. And it's still something I think we have issues with today, in sort of explaining science to, you know, to regular people. And it's confusing because sometimes science is a process. It's not usually a definitive statement, right?
Right. Yeah. I had a question about I think I should probably move on to make sure that I get to all my questions about Northrup. I was thinking about how the smallpox, or the cowpox rather, arm-to-arm vaccination that I was reading about it in Eula Biss's book, and how that was actually like a populist discovery that didn't have to sort of like come to the population from a top-down public health perspective. People understood that milkmaids didn't get cowpox, and so why was that? And so maybe there are some instances too in which people do develop a kind of very advanced understanding, and they don't really have to be convinced about something that seems scientific and abstract.
Yeah, I mean, smallpox is really fascinating, right? Yeah. I could probably go off on a tangent for an hour on that, but I will say that, you know, once once Jenner came up with the idea, or sort of discovered that milkmaids didn't get cowpox, and then sort of comes up with this idea to vaccinate. Well, vaccination actually, vacca for cow, right? Vacca is Latin for cow.
Right.
And there was a lot of conspiracy theories around smallpox vaccinations back then. You can see there are a lot of really great images of women getting vaccinations and then having a cow head pop up from their arm, right? That vaccinating someone would give you bovine features.
Oh my gosh, that would just fit right into the meme economy of the present day, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. My students love all of those images, but it sort of tells you that vaccine conspiracies have been around for a very long time.
Right. Slightly different direction. I do a lot of research on charismatic authority as a cult researcher, and I find that it's often the case that charisma finds a cultural gap in knowledge or service, and then it kind of expands in that space. Now, I mainly study male charismatic leaders, and they typically carve out an unregulated space between religion, politics, self-help. Now, with a figure who does something similar from a feminist direction and in women's health, this feels more complex. Now, so are there ways in which you'd say that charismatic and intuitive leadership have been really useful in women's health and practiced by women doctors?
I think that, typically, when women physicians entered the field, and I mean, again, I'm talking historically, they made an argument for themselves that they belonged in the medical field because of their identities as women, right? That only women could properly take care of other women. Now, there was some disagreement among women physicians who saw sort of the downside of making that argument. But typically, I mean, a lot of women do go to women physicians because they want to see they want to be seen by a woman. But that was absolutely an entry point for women physicians who, made a very specific argument that they would be better suited to answer the needs of other women. I'm trying to think of someone who with a medical degree, who sort of has that charismatic nature that you're talking about throughout history. I'm not quite thinking of one, although I will tell you, can I tell you about my favorite?
Yes, sure, please.
Figure in history who I think sort of embodies a lot of these things that you're talking about, and whether it was helpful or not is debatable. But my favorite character is a woman named Lydia Pinkham. She is amazing. So she was a woman in the 19th century. She invented sort of this woman's compound called Pinkham's vegetable compound. And she did so because her husband or her family was sort of suffering in the Depression of the 1870s. And so she decided to start this family business and make this tonic. She made it, on her stovetop at first before they sort of scaled up. She invented this compound, and this was at the height of sort of the patent medicine era, right? Or what we might call quack medicine. And it was to relieve women's menstrual problems, maybe their menopausal issues, or, she would advertise it as, are you suffering from sort of like weak womanhood? Do you need need a restoration of your energy? And it was a mixture of things like, fenugreek and unicorn root and black cohosh, and alcohol, basically. But
I mean, as a preservative, like it was a tincture or something like that? She boiled it down?
And it's really interesting because her whole family were huge temperance activists.
Right.
But there was quite a bit of alcohol.
But this is what you could take, right?
Yeah. but the important thing to know about Pinkham is that she developed a cult following. She was very, very popular, and she did aggressive marketing. She's one of the first people that actually put her face on packages.
Wow.
Right? So you'd go and you'd get this in the mail, and it would have her face on it. And so she becomes this moment where you're linking a medicine to a particular woman, right? And she asked women to write to her, and that she would, about their problems, and that she would answer every single one of them personally.
What,
now,
private
of
letters?
course,
Private letters?
Yes.
Wow.
Although, I mean, I don't think she was answering all of them. I think
Right.
it was, her family members. It was like a whole family business.
Wow.
But she did reply to people. And so you can see that sort of, there's a whole history of letter writing between women. So that, that's a way that, I think women really trusted Lydia Pinkham. But again, she was filling a need that the medical establishment at the time was not even paying attention to. And so, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound is still around.
Seriously?
You can buy it on, actually, I mean, I've got a package right here.
Oh
yeah.
My gosh.
It doesn't have the same, they market it as an herbal supplement now.
Right.
Which I think is interesting because herbal supplements are very, I feel like in some ways are the patent medicine of today. But it's still around. You can buy it on Amazon. There are people on YouTube who've made testimonials about how effective Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound is. It's not unlike the testimonials that Lydia Pinkham used to publish.
Wow.
There's a whole drinking song called Lily the Pink about Lydia Pinkham. You could go on YouTube and find it.
Now, when you say a cult following, because when we talked about, when I asked you the question, you were saying, you were like, well, I'm wondering if there's somebody who ticks all of those boxes. I'm imagining that the argument that the woman doctor would have to make to their colleagues would involve a certain amount of like very confident presentation. I can do this, and women are the best people to take care of women. So I can imagine that pitch also being made to their client base, to their patient base, but there would have to be some sort of public entrepreneurial thing to it as well. And it sounds like Pinkham is really covering that. But is she out giving lectures and stuff and going to conferences or?
No, well, so she's not a physician. Yeah, right. She's not a physician. She's just a woman who, at the time anybody could make patent medicines and sell them because we don't have the FDA yet. And she was just a woman who family was in economic crisis and decided to sell her home remedy that she, claims she had been making for forever. Right. And, really, and again, that whole home remedy, folk remedy thing had a long history. Right. And, she didn't go to conferences or anything like that, but her marketing, she was an aggressive marketer. Brochures and ads in newspapers. And you can go to Google and, Google her name and you'll see a ton of different ads come up. So she's really one of the very first women who really aggressively marketed her, herself as a healer and her medicine as a healer. And it was really a catch-all. Anything that had to do with any sort of woman problem.
It's interesting. It's so interesting that she's coming up in relation to Dr. Northrup because women's bodies, women's wisdom is like, I think it's like 1,100 pages long. So it is literally anything that has to do with women's medical issues. And also like, I believe on both editions of the book, it is Dr. Northrup's face. And so I'm thinking about Pinkham's face being on the bottle. Was that unique for the time period, or were male patent medicine guys putting their faces on bottles too?
I mean, so, people did put faces on their medicines, and sometimes it was, a made-up figure, like a mascot or something like that. And sometimes it was the person who was selling it. Absolutely. Right. But this is really, Pinkham took it to a whole new level because of how much she marketed. And it is really the first time where it's a woman's picture and it's actually the likeness of Lydia Pinkham, right? So it's not a representation of what she looks like. It's an actual sort of drawing of her.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, she never, getting back to this whole prosperity gospel thing, she dies before her family her family does end up making quite a bit of money, but she's never really very wealthy.
Right.
But I do think it's interesting, in terms of sort of being very aggressive and not shy about putting her face on a box and
Right.
really selling her product.
And as for wealth, I mean, I suppose if she'd been able to monetize the letter writing back and forth between her and her clients, as people do on social media today, it might have been a little bit different.
Absolutely.
Now, okay, so interesting to think of Northrup with this Pinkham history behind her, because, as I said, this Bible is all about women's issues, and it also has what feels like a conservative and old-timey gender politics to it. The opening line of the book is, quote, "The female body was designed by our Creator to be a source of pleasure, fertility, movement, strength, and well-being. Our bodies connect us with the moon, the tides, and the seasons. They are the temples within which our souls dwell and experience life on earth, and they are profoundly impacted first and foremost by our beliefs about what is possible, by the culture in which we live, and then by the behaviors that stem from these beliefs." Does this sound like an opening that could be, like, I don't know, 50 years old or 100 years old? It feels like it comes out of another time.
Yeah, but I mean, it's comfort. Like, there's something really comforting about that
Absolutely.
argument, right? That talking about sort of essentializing gender and sex roles it's very like, it gives you a sense of order to a chaotic universe.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a sense of control. It gives us almost a sense of power, right? And this is, it does sound very sort of 1970s to me, but it's also, getting back to that, argument that I was talking about earlier, where, physicians like Elizabeth Blackwell, the arguments that they were making about being a woman's right to be a doctor is cut from the same cloth, right? That women, there's something essential about women, and their knowledge, and their essential being as women that are best suited to take care of other women, right? And so I find that really interesting, right? Their feminine sensibilities makes you a better physician. But the con with that then, and some physicians at the time, like Mary Putnam Jacobi, recognized this, right? That if you, from a physician's perspective, if you argue that women are best suited to treat other women, that boxes you into only treating women, right? And that is an issue in itself. And from the patient's perspective, those essentialized gender roles, can be, what if your body doesn't conform to that? What if it doesn't reproduce? What if you miscarry? What if you're infertile, right? What if you don't, fit into those sort of boxes of these sort of, gender is the sort of in the universe sort of moon tide kind of thing.
Right.
Then there's something wrong with you. And so, I find in some ways it's interesting because I find those words sometimes comforting, but I also find them really disquieting as well.
Right.
But these arguments were also made not just in the history of women's health. These same essentializing arguments were made suffrage activists, right? Would argue that the essential characteristics of women, their feminine nature, would make them better and more moral voters.
Right.
People like Phyllis Schlafly, who was against the ERA, was also making these very essentializing arguments about women's nature.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, within all of that, she does and we've been talking about this, she does extend a kind of feminist analysis through her work. There's strong gender binarism in it. And she is resisting, as she says, medical patriarchy, and people find that very compelling. She says almost nothing about class or the social determinants of health. Her book is very long, but I word searched it for things like universal healthcare. I'm speaking to you from Canada, by the way. I word searched socialized medicine. There's just no hits. So she's writing from an American context. I understand that, but what else comes to mind for you when you think about exclusions like that within like the context of women's health, where social determinants have to be like a huge consideration?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked me this. I find this aspect of Northrup's writing and her philosophy the most problematic, right? In some ways, as you mentioned, coming from Canada, it's the most Americanized, right? It's sort of this idea that, again, as we were talking about before, there's the idea that you have control over your body and its destiny and its health destiny in some ways is very comforting.
Right.
But it completely and totally ignores systemic issues in our country that lead to disparities in healthcare. And I find that quite disturbing, right? We don't have universal healthcare. We don't have socialized medicine. And her rhetoric completely lies in the power of the individual. It reminds me a little bit of a documentary that I often show my students and ask them to problematize. And that is the documentary that Ricky Lake made back in the 90s called The Business of Being Born.
Oh, I recall that. Yeah.
Right. Where it's all about the movement, the home birth movement, right?
Yes,
Nothing necessarily wrong with the home birth movement, but the way in which she makes this argument that in Europe, all women give birth with midwives. Most women give birth with midwives, right? They have a whole midwifery system, right?
Right.
And that women in Europe have lower maternal mortality rates. And so she draws a straight connection between midwives and lower maternal mortality rates, right?
And not socialized medicine.
Exactly. And not the fact that women have, depending on your class and your race, your employment status, may not have access to prenatal health care. They may not have had access to regular care as a woman throughout their entire lives. They may have health disparities because of poverty. She doesn't talk about any of those things, right?
Right.
And so, this whole rhetoric reminds me a lot of that. And I think if you view this argument through the lens of race, the problem becomes even clearer, right? African-American women, Latina women, I mean, they're dying of COVID rates at much higher rates than white folks. There's racism in healthcare, access to quality care in hospitals, police violence, which is also tied up in the wellness of marginalized communities. These things are baked into the system.
Right.
And blaming it on the individual takes away from the collective action that we should be taking.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that is the most disturbing aspect of Northrup's whole individual aspect of her philosophy.
Thinking about Ricky Lake's documentary and this correlation that she makes between lower mortality rates and countries that have midwifery systems, but excluding the socialized medicine part, is really testimony to how effective the American propaganda around universal health care actually is, that it kind of erases it as a factor or something that people would consider in their actual outcomes. It's like, and speaking as a Canadian, I can just say that universalized healthcare is not equally accessible to everybody. There are many problems with the system, but it is so baked into the national identity that one really doesn't have to one really doesn't have to think about it. The paradigm of approaching a health problem is the notion of collective care, and that's going to be stable, that's going to be secure. And so I always sort of look at the American wellness influencer as somebody who's really both being created by, but also necessitated by an environment in which really everybody's left to their own devices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's a lot more, it's easier to take control of a problem if it's within your own means, right? All I have to do is A, B, and C, and I can, be well. It's a lot scarier to think that everyone has to work on something together as a collective and to change something that's a lot bigger than just an individual. And it also, sort of flies against the grain of sort of American exceptionalism and individualism, right?
I think you've been very generous with your time. I think I've got one last question, which, this is coming right to the heart of our podcast project. We're doing this research, we're doing this coverage because of Northrup's turn into what we're calling, or what people have called, conspirituality, and we've already done some reporting on that, just on the face of it, one sort of major factor in this story is that Northrup's Facebook page was actually the mainstream gateway for the viral spread of the documentary Plandemic. And that really boosted the shares of that documentary from these weird QAnon groups into the mainstream. And so I'm just wondering did you find that surprising? Is there any precedent for that? What do you make of it? Do you think is there a logic there? If we're going to take this seriously, as you said in the beginning, as a historical arc, where's the through line?
Oh, well, I'm actually not surprised at all, right?
Oh.
I think that health and conspiracy theories go hand in hand. The through line perhaps is that one of the through lines, I would argue, is that we have a tendency to capitalize on fear and perpetuate blame.
Right.
And we can go all the way back to the Athenian plague in 430 BCE, where where the Athenians blamed the Spartans for poisoning the well, and that was the cause of the plague. The 14th century Black Death, people blamed Jewish folks, again, saying that they were poisoning the wells.
Right.
And that's what was causing the illness. And Jewish folks were persecuted and burned at the stake. Syphilis, which is always a fun topic. Syphilis, before it had the name syphilis, over time, depending on where you were, it was either called the French disease, the Polish disease, the German disease.
I did not know that.
Right. So it was always
I think I heard French disease, but I didn't know that it quoted from country to country.
It's always like the people that you don't like.
Right.
It would be called it would be called that disease, right? And I could go on and on and on. Cholera. We had a cholera outbreak in Britain in the 1830s. People started attacking, like mobs would attack doctors on the street, accusing them of taking cholera victims to the hospital in order to kill them and use them for dissections in anatomy schools.
Wow.
Getting back to the cowpox thing, right? There's also a very long history of vaccine conspiracy. So I think there's something very, I think there's just something very scary about, I think it's possibly tied to, not only wellness, but, death, right? And we're all afraid of dying. And I think that, when it comes to the human body, in some ways it can feel so out of control that it almost makes sense to map on these other people, these other things that are happening. And so these, when pandemic, when this whole COVID outbreak started happening, talking with a lot of my colleagues, we knew that people were going to start blaming other people, right? And that they were going to be tying it up into all sorts of conspiracies, that there was going to be a race aspect to it, with the Chinese flu,
right?
Which is also nothing new if we think about the bubonic plague in San Francisco in the early 1900s. And we knew that there was going to be a whole sort of regimen of rejecting medical science, especially when the science isn't clear right now and we're in the unknown territory, and that there would be a outcropping of sort of new quack medicine. And all of those things have happened. So in some ways, none of this behavior is surprising.
I guess maybe the thing that's surprising is its connection to women's health and wellness, although, through the anti-vax movement, the sentiments that are mobilized, especially by people like Wakefield, are really about, are we protecting mother's intuition? But it creates this weird environment in which Dr. Northrup has done all of this wonderful work in terms of, upping the conversation around autonomy and agency and whether or not women are making their own health decisions or not. What I find in her social media feeds is that she's deferring basically to male conspiracy theorists for her data. And it's weird. It's almost as if she grows up rejecting medical patriarchy, and now she's kind of adopted almost like a conspiratorial patriarchy of players who are feeding this strange information. So I find that very disquieting.
I love that term, conspiratorial patriarchy. I mean, that's fascinating, right?
Well,
to think about.
I actually haven't. I mean, this would be a great research subject in itself, but I don't know of I don't know of a leading conspirituality evangelist or somebody who has put forward a new theory about something who's not a man. And I also don't know if there are if any of the media platforms like Del Bigtree, Green Med Info, Natural News, I don't know if any of those media platforms are controlled by women either. So I'm in the academic context of conspirituality, as outlined by Ward and Voas, they say quite plainly, and it's just in the abstract, that conspiratorial thinking is generally male identified, and that the spirituality part of conspirituality is the feminine identified new age or utopian sentiments that come together in this strange combination, but one's following the other. It's not like I'm not seeing women playing a leadership role in terms of generating these ideas.
I find that really fascinating. And I mean, you're right. That is ripe for a wonderful research project.
I might be wrong, but I just haven't seen it.
It that tracks to me. And it gets back to that earlier conversation we were having about gender essentialism, right? That Northup is in this really interesting position where she's making these feminist arguments, but then also relying on sort of gender essentialism. And Andrew Wakefield is a great example of that. I mean, he's almost sort of like the father figure.
Literally.
Yeah.
She goes on his podcast on Mother's Day and says, and she says to him, "You've been this is a paraphrase, but it's basically, you've been so wonderful in your protection of women and mothers through the years. And it's the male's role to protect and to nurture. And you've done that so well." And it's like, I mean, I almost had a stroke, but like, it's so difficult to watch her bend the knee at somebody like that. And on that note, who are your favorite? I wanted to end in a really happy place. Who are your favorite women medical thinkers and practitioners and advocates right now?
Oh, that
Especially in relation to COVID, like anybody who's doing the best, most interesting work that you know of.
well, I mean, that's a really hard question. I'm gonna sort of sidetrack this a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things that I am most interested in is especially in the COVID debates, and sort of, this moment that we're in, is the intersection of race, gender, and disability. Right?
Wow.
I think that there is a wonderful disability community on Twitter. And so I'm thinking of women like Alice Wong, who herself is a disabled woman. She just came out with a new book. And they're really sort of tackling health from a disability perspective that I think is important, not just for people in the disability community, but it's important for all of us to, be thinking about these things. And some of the arguments that they're making, for example, that looking at mortality rates as an indication of how dangerous a pandemic is maybe a little bit misleading, because
Right.
we need to be thinking about how disabling these and long-lasting health effects that this pandemic
Right.
it is.
It's such a great point. It's such a great point, especially as we see all of this data rolling out around possible long-term brain damage or neurological impacts, or people
Yeah.
who got COVID in their 30s I'm just realizing, just hearing you say that there's kind of an erasure of disability in the focus on case fatality rate. That's an amazing thought. Yeah.
And we should really be taking our lead from people who are disabled themselves, and sort of
Right.
who have been thinking about and theorizing about health and wellness, and for a long time.
Right.
And in sort of making us, making people who are able-bodied or identified able-bodied, rethink our paradigms about what it is to be well.
Right.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, and that's going to necessitate thinking about wellness in public terms and collective terms and social terms, because that's the thing about my limited understanding of disability studies is that this is a world that is made for some people but not others, and we have to change the world, and we have to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I really love history geeks. That was such a great interview. And I love her. I love people who are enthusiastic about history, because it's something I come across as I'm going through the process of writing this book on psychedelics. It's like, do you want to understand why psychedelics are illegal in America today? Well, you have to look at the history of race in America if you want to do that. And when you put these together, these connections, it's just, there's something fascinating about it, but you can also connect the dots. So when Professor Antonovich was talking about Samuel Hahnemann, I have a particular fascination and slight disdain with homeopathy, because Hahnemann was a trained medical doctor who thought that the medical industry was barbaric. Bloodletting, he didn't agree with it. And the basis of his system is sound, right? Homeopathy at its base, a little bit cures, more of it, that's vaccination. And so when Edward Jenner was able to show the efficacy of vaccinations, Hahnemann was very happy. But today you have homeopathists and traditional Chinese medical practitioners who think that vaccines are bullshit, but their founders all knew that the science was sound, or at least they thought it was, and that's how they treated people. And when she makes that connection with Northrup in the 70s, talking about what female health was at that time, well, she had good reason to be skeptical. And I think that that's the sort of nuance that I hope we can bring out sometimes in this podcast, but it's also missing in all of the discussions that we have online, where people say these things and there's just this automatic, the impossibility of having nuanced dialogue online and the channels that we're using is really unfortunate. And that's what really came out in the interview for me, is how well she was able to discuss nuance.
Yeah, can I ask you a question about Hanuman, actually?
Sure.
Because I'm wondering, I mean, just the principle of withdrawing interventions to the point of disappearance, that some sort of, ultimate jacking of the placebo effect or something like that is really compelling. Did you come across anything that indicated that his former participation in conventional medicine had burdened him with a sense of guilt? Because I detect that part of the story underlying a number of the stories that we cover. Like, I think it's really poignant that Northrup talks about how many boys she circumcised, right? And how many birth interventions she participated in that she feels now were unnecessary. I've got a bunch of other examples too, but was there a sense of guilt or shame or atonement that homeopathy begins with?
It is definitely possible, because he does talk about his role in that industry, but I don't know how much. It's hard to look back and do armchair psychiatry on him now, because
Right.
it's not clear, because I did read the foundational book of homeopathy when I was doing research for another book. And and to answer another part of that question, I don't know exactly when the placebo idea really took hold, because even today there are homeopathic products on the shelves that do contain active ingredients,
Right.
and those active ingredients are actually illegal in pharmaceuticals, but because they're presented as supplements, they can get around that, which
Wow.
makes them dangerous. And there has been evidence of homeopathic products in the past that specifically have harmed children because of that loophole. But I don't know when the idea that a little bit of a substance became no substance whatsoever with the provings. And because that's really the fascinating aspect of all this to me. But to get back to the guilt aspect, I would imagine that played a role, but I have no specific evidence that I can cite.
Yeah, I mean, I was going through. Go ahead, Julian.
Well,
Yeah.
it's my understanding with homeopathy is that there's two sort of key principles, right? One is that like cures like, but the other is that the more you dilute a substance, the more powerful it becomes.
Yes.
And going the further they've gone down that road, the further they've gone away from like cures like still being a meaningful statement, right?
Yes. And there's even, I always use this one because it's the most popular. I always forget how to pronounce it, even though it's the most popular flu medication in France, and that's like, thank you, right?
Yeah.
And that's like $40 million a year. And I always wonder, do vegans or vegetarians take it?
Goose liver, right?
The proving starts with a duck liver. By the time you take it, there's no duck liver in it. It's just sugar water. That's all you take in. But a duck had to be killed in order for it to be made regardless.
Yeah.
So because I have known vegetarians who take it, and I ask them that, and it's like one of those questions where, again, if you don't research, but what's your stance on that?
It's technically vegan.
Technically,
but in
yes.
the process of it, it's not vegan.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, on the just back to the guilt thing for the moment, I'm sort of fixated on it because I came across this podcast recording of Kelly Brogan talking to her friend Charles Eisenstein, and she speaks at length in many different places about how she was a prescribing psychiatrist for many years, and she focused primarily on pre and postnatal women and figuring out how to prescribe psychiatric medications to women who are breastfeeding and so on. And she is obviously disgusted by this this part of her training, but also this part of her profession, that it really turned her away. There was a point at which she described writing a prescription for Zoloft for a lactating woman and telling herself, or hearing herself say inside, well, I wouldn't take this myself. And that sort of began her turn away. But then with Eisenstein, she describes how um, she describes with disgust that her colleagues are able to medicate people into a kind of submission to the world destroying machine, but also, and this is a sort of like a key link to the to her current fascinations, also very sort of disgusted or horrified at the fact that practicing psychiatrists can forcibly inject people undergoing psychiatric crises, and they can deprive them of civil liberties and have them, forcibly hospitalized. And so there's a real sort of like rejection of a kind of violence done against the psychiatric patient that's at the root of the will to protect people's civil liberties, but it carries with it this: I was participating in something that was wrong, and I'm not making that mistake anymore. And there's a hint too of I'm atoning for something.
Yeah, what's so difficult about that is that in any of these sorts of arenas where something like that is true, the rejection of the thing that is demonstrably brutal or was morally wrong or was scientifically barbaric, that we've hopefully come a fair distance from at this point, the conflation of that with whatever the new set of alternative ideas or beliefs or protocols or diagnostic and treatment methodologies are, those things get conflated, so that in any kind of debate about this, to justify the second thing, they'll go to the first thing. And the first thing, if you're really open and listening to them and being an empathic human being who's giving them the benefit of the doubt in that moment that they're arguing in good faith, it's legitimate. To me, it comes down to something I find myself saying to people again and again, say with regard to science, that the only remedy for corrupted science is better science.
Right.
It's not going to be some alternate way of coming at what the truth is. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I know. I was just going to say that we've remarked many times that the figures that we speak about come to the end of a kind of scientific conundrum and they flip into a different discourse. So that's where the sermon comes in, or that's where we're going to rely on yoga, or we're suddenly going to talk about 5D consciousness or something like that, because we're actually at the end of our research capacity.
That's
right.
That's right. And so this thing, so for example, with Kelly Brogan, this way that psychiatric patients have been horribly mistreated, the answer to that is to now go down this entirely other road. And part of what I hear in her as well is this idea that through some sort of spiritual process, you become an autonomous spiritual adult. And that spiritual adulthood is then also linked to a kind of freedom from anyone else telling you what to do or how to think. And there was that meme that you referenced last week or the week before that was something like where we would come to in a medical model where there was an understanding that whatever each of us believes is actually what's real, right? Do you remember?
Right. Well, medicine is a personal belief system, I think.
Exactly.
Was at the heart of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I didn't ask Professor Antonovich about, well, I don't know if I could really have asked her. I mean, I started to ask about whether or not Lydia Pinkham's face being on her formula was sort of a unique moment. And she said, well, there were male figures who had their images on their medications and so on their patents,
on their tonics.
Right, on their tonics, but she did say Pinkham's was the first image that was actually a likeness, and I think that's really, I wanted to push that a little bit or rest on it, because there's something about that we can connect to contemporary influencers, because it's the point at which the personableness and therefore the charisma of the healer becomes something that's really remarkable. Something, it's part of the commodity, it's part of the placebo effect. It's her face is right there on the bottle, and as we know with most of these, with a lot of these writers and thinkers in conspirituality, it's their headshot that's on the front of their books, right? So it's not that the books are going to be about their subjects. The books are really about them. And
yeah, but
a,
even more than that, it's them as an archetype,
right,
right?
right.
It's believe this or take this product, drink this tonic, and you will be like me. I am whatever, happy, empowered, incredible person. And when you were talking with her about Louise Hay, who I'm familiar with as well, it made me think too of Carolyn Mace. And Carolyn Mace was really, really popular when I was first sort of coming up in the Los Angeles spiritual yoga community. Everyone was really into Carolyn Mace, and she's brilliant. She had a lot of really interesting things to say, but I'll never forget listening to one of her lectures that everyone had glowingly recommended to me. And she said, "It doesn't surprise me that it is the two groups of people with the most victim consciousness in our society that are afflicted, that have been afflicted most with HIV." And she said, Blacks and gays. And I was just dumbfounded, you know, and that thing has incensed me so much with regard to trauma as well, that so much in the New Age community around spiritual bypass, there's this idea that the way, and it goes back to what you were saying about that kind of double bind situation or Kafka trap, right? Where the way to be free and to be healed from your horrific trauma that you suffered in childhood is to stop playing the victim, right? Recognize that you chose it. Recognize that you're not actually someone who was victimized and it was perfect. And then you'll be free. And the horrific kind of psychological dissonance of that to me is so damaging.
Yeah, it really uproots a fundamental reality principle, and I didn't hear its implication, I think, until I was doing my book on Joyce, and I was speaking with Karen Rain by phone, who's one of the main interview subjects, and she said, we need to reclaim the word victim as a legal term, not as a psychologized term. The victim describes something to whom something has been done, and not somebody who's taken an attitude towards the fact that they were sexually assaulted, for instance. And so yeah, I would love to see if somebody's done their PhD in the rhetoric of the word victim, because that would be amazing to see where that started. But it's got to be back there sometime in the early 80s, in that whole Hay House field.
Yeah, I would think so. One other thing I just wanted to say, Matthew, about this interview, which I thought was fantastic, is that I think it really, really fleshes out what we've been doing so far on this topic around really recognizing, and we've tried to touch on it at different moments with curiosity, but I feel like this interview really goes there. Recognizing the legitimate concerns, the legitimate sense of betrayal and abuse that has gone on through the history of medical science as an imperfect cultural and scientific endeavor.
Right.
Yes.
Well, great. I'm glad we were able to do it.
I'll end on this. I just also loved near the end where she discusses that a lot of conspiracy theories have to do with health, and that how she even said that she was talking to her colleagues right before when the pandemic was starting, and they
predicted it all.
Get ready, here it's coming.
Yeah. Yeah, none of this is new, right? This happens every fucking time.
Right.